Welcome to today's Economy Committee meeting, where we'll be discussing London's culture off the beaten track. Please could I ask everyone to switch off their electronic devices to silent mode to avoid any interruptions this morning. Can I ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Harani, for whom Assembly Member Clark is substituting.
Perfect. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Noted. Brilliant. Can we confirm the minutes of the Economy Committee meeting held on the 18th of May 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Confirmed.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions arising from previous meetings?
Noted.
Thank you. Now, we're about to move on to our main item of business, the discussion with invited guests on London's culture off the beaten track. And I'm really pleased to welcome our guests today. Clara Cullen, Venue Support Manager from the Music Venue Trust. Lorna Lee, Assistant Director of Culture and Heritage, London Borough of Waltham Forest. Paul Bristow, Director of Strategic Partnerships, the Arts Council England, and Aditi Anand, Artistic Director for the Migration Museum from Lewisham. And we are joined virtually today, thank you very much, Abdul Shayak, from the Artistic Director and Joint CEO from the Tara Theatre. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. And I understand that you will have to leave because you're busy rehearsing at 11 o'clock. So we'll make sure that we've got plenty of questions for you the first part of the session. Can I also note that the committee is very disappointed that unfortunately the Deputy Mayor, Justine Simons, was not able to attend today's meeting or the dates that we've got committed for our round table. And we are disappointed because we were very keen to hear from her, but we will be setting out some very direct questions to her by letter, and we're sure that the panel will also help us with those kind of questions as well that we need to direct directly to the Deputy Mayor. Thank you very much. So I'm going to also start off with the first set of 3 questions for you, and it's going to be for all the guests. I'm very happy to direct the questions along, but if anyone wants to interject at any point, you're very welcome to do so. So Abdul, do make sure that you indicate as clearly as you can so that we can let you know if we can when you're ready to speak. So the first question is, how important are London's small cultural organisations and grassroots culture, and what role does it play in local communities? Now, I know you're going to say it's very important, but let's get down to the detail here. Why? Should we start with Clara?
Sure. So I think in my sector, which is grassroots music venues, so small music venues, the way that I sort of describe these music venues they're sort of like the A&R department of the live music industry. So it's where you get artists who are new and developing, just emerging artists at the beginning of their careers. They play these rooms, and that's where they can learn their skills. That's where they can learn how to interact with an audience, whether their songs are any good, what they need to change about their set. And it kind of acts as this sort of training and development hub for these artists at this kind of emerging level. And then obviously the UK is, and London in particular, is fantastic at developing artists. We have a great kind of history of artists who genuinely are world beating and kind of set records and things like that. But it all starts at these small venues. Everyone that you could pretty much mention anyone, and I could probably tell you where they played at a small venue in London, and that's where it really starts. It's where audiences get their kind of a kind of visceral connection with the performer, with the artist. You can, in most of these places, literally touch the artist over the PA and things like that. And so I think it really acts as the sort of engine of the wider live music economy. Everyone sort of talks about the big record labels or Glastonbury or whatever, but it all starts at playing in front of 100 people, usually playing to about 3 people and maybe your mum, and that's where it starts. So that's what my sector or my level of the sector does.
Yes, Lorna.
Thank you. So I'll just pick up on the sort of the local small cultural organisations being part of that wider ecology of London, and often they're the supply chain or they're part of creating some of the bigger the bigger pieces that people might be more aware of. But from my perspective, which was really important in Borough of Culture and almost came to life through COVID, was that they really know their communities. They really know, often reflect the diversity of their communities, and they can really garner very, hyper-local community participation, even if that's virtually somehow. And I think as part of that, they're actually very well placed to address some social issues. So whether that's isolation, not necessarily through COVID, mental health, and can really support local well-being as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to Abdul, if that's okay, panel. And Abdul, would you like to contribute?
I'd just like to second all of that. I think from a Tara perspective, if you look at our history, things like Goodness Gracious Me started life at Tara. Ayub Khan Dean, who wrote East is East, started his life at Tara in terms of having that interaction with theatre and with a live audience. And I would also say we know our communities in a way that larger organisations don't. And I think that gives us the upper hand, I guess, in many ways, to connect with those communities and serve those communities and their needs. We are also, in my opinion, a much easier space for Black, Asian, ethnically diverse, global majority audiences to go into, because it's smaller, it's less intimidating, and we are more welcoming. I think what we have at Tara is a really diverse team, and so we understand our audiences in a way that larger organizations don't. So yeah, all of those things really. And during we'll come on to that, but
Thank you, and do come in with more later, Abdul. Thank you so much for raising your hand. That's the best way to do it for us on Zoom. Paul, would you like to add?
Just a couple of things. And hello, everybody. And it's I'm going to agree with everything that's been said. I'm kind of running out of things to say because all the contributions I completely agree with. I think there's something else I'd add, which is as well that often those smaller organisations can be quite fleet of foot. They can take advantage of opportunities in local areas and make a real difference. So some of the things that Lorna was talking about in terms of kind of the social value that can be brought to a place and the real difference that can be made to people's lives. Very often those organisations that are smaller are able to spot those opportunities when they're needed and really take them very quickly. And I think as well, they add kind of colour and life to places in really important ways. And I think if you went to kind of any celebration a few weeks ago around the Jubilee, you'll have seen local artists operating as part of that and people really loving it. And that's because they've come out of a really strong ecology of grassroots organisations across London.
DT, the Migration Museum isn't a shopping mall, isn't it? Tell us a little bit about why you think that's been a benefit, or even maybe the challenges that you found.
Yes, so the Migration Museum, we've been based at the Lewisham Shopping Centre in what used to be an H&M before, since February 2020. And I think, speaking to what everyone else is saying about flexibility, agility, and being able to know your community better, certainly being in the heart of a kind of shopping centre really dissolves those barriers of engagement with our audiences, because, it's people coming in who might be doing their weekly shop at the Sainsbury who then pop into the museum. So it really becomes a welcoming space where you can just wander in. And as a result of that, and being a bit flexible means that, if community members come in and they have a desire for us to do a program or to use the space, we can make that available to them as well. And I think it's like an interesting point of, saying that smaller culture organizations can be feeders into larger organizations, but I think they can also be just world-class culture on your doorstep in their own right. And provide that experience without necessarily having to travel into central London. And that's really important for local schools, for local communities to have that.
And I mean, there are lots of children who are going past your museum all the time, aren't they? And just being able to just pop in
Absolutely.
And
So
anytime they want. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a huge contingent of just teenagers, who hang out in the shopping centre after school.
That's what they do.
Because that's really the only place left for people to be. So to actually have a place where they can wander in, they don't have a pressure to buy anything. You can just hang out in the space. That's a real opportunity.
Yeah. And I mean, let's touch on the challenges, though, because small museums and theatres are facing a lot of challenges, particularly in the financial circumstances that we're finding London in at the moment. And those, particularly in Outer London, and there's some Assembly members here who represent Outer London who've seen theatres and museums closing. In comparison to the larger cultural institutions, what are the challenges that you find? Let's start with the Migration Museum.
Well, I think first is just awareness and lack of proximity to other organisations. So, once we have people through our doors and they know about us, we know that we have very high levels of engagement, learning. We measure really well on that. But it's just about having that awareness. And for an organisation that's small like ours, we really aren't able to dedicate a sizable marketing budget to do that. So to be able to have support from the mayor's office or other institutions to kind of put us on the map, that's incredibly important. And I would say secondly, I don't know if this applies to everyone, but certainly for us as an organisation that doesn't have a permanent space, just that lack of security of tenure means it's incredibly difficult to do any kind of long-term planning. And to really then invest in the space that we're in and the communities that we're in.
If you were to find your permanent place, be honest, where would you really want to be?
Obviously we want to be somewhere where there's footfall and where there's proximity to, the Tube and other cultural organisations, so we can feed off of each other.
Are you saying it's easier to be more central for a museum?
Yes, absolutely.
Which is a challenge, isn't it? Finding that space if you were to move, yeah. Paul, what are the challenges?
So I think there's a challenge. I think there's a significant challenge for the smaller organisations in attracting some of the public funding, because often the public funders require match funding, and if you're a smaller organisation, it can be difficult to get hold of that. I mean, that's something that we've done a bit of work looking at, and we've reduced the thresholds and we've reduced the requirement for match funding for our National Lottery project grants, but it's still difficult. And how do you get the capacity if you're a small organisation? The bigger ones often have that capacity, those staff members and the existing relationships to be able to do those sorts of things. And I do know that local authorities are really important in this space, as well as providing some of that capacity, some of that networking, some of that brokerage and some of that support. But obviously, they've had their own challenges over the last few years as well. So I think that's a particular issue that's facing that part of the sector.
I'm going to open up to the other guests. I mean, who's willing to contribute without? I realise we don't want to repeat anything. But do Lorna, Clara, do you have anything to add?
Sure. So I am really worried. If I'm honest, I think the next 6 months to a year is going to be a really challenging period for grassroots music venues. I think, everyone's sort of talking about recovery, and I think in truth it's going to be more about sort of stabilisation and see until we, maybe even for 2 years, until we sort of see pre-pandemic levels of kind of footfall. And we're seeing across the board about a 20% no-show rate, so people who've bought advance tickets but not turning up to shows. Cost of living crisis. I was talking to a London venue this morning. Their energy bill has gone up from 1,600 to 2,100. That's a big gap when less people are coming to shows, less people are spending money on the bar. So it is creating quite a pressurized environment. And what's that saying where it's out of the oven and into the frying pan? That's sort of what it feels like, in that we've come through the pandemic, which was absolutely an existential crisis for the live music industry, but we've come into a period which has its own very, very challenging circumstances, and it does as someone who tends to be an optimist, it is cause for concern.
And just picking up on the importance of local authorities, so the main museum in Waltham Forest is the William Morris Gallery, which is local authority run, and that fared pretty well through the pandemic, and going forwards is much better connected across the council to the communities, so that and now that we're looking more at 15-minute neighbourhoods, local people spending their leisure time locally in a way can boost that. So it's how do we do that? But the other side of the coin is quite a lot of the grassroots cultural sector in Waltham Forest isn't venue based, so it missed out on grants. A lot of them are freelancers, so actually they kept falling through the gaps in the pavement of the grant landscape. So they're extremely vulnerable and feeling that they're only just keeping their head above water. And with confidence is coming back, but it's not quite back there yet. It is. I've spoken to a few that feel like they're still in a very fragile state.
Thank you so much. Is there a particular part of London's cultural sector about which you have particular concerns for its survival at all? So should we go for Paul for that question first?
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick up on Clara's
And you made you, yeah.
Yeah, and Clara's point around grassroots music venues, I mean, clearly there's a lot of challenges around there at the moment. The landlords of a lot of those venues are coming under a lot of pressure themselves to meet the cost of living and the inflationary pressures, which puts pressure on rents and puts pressure on booking venues. So in terms of, being able to keep those venues going, there's a particular challenge at the moment, which is quite pressing. I think a lot of small-scale art centres, which perhaps have been quite successful in driving earned income through, maybe providing services or through, catering or hiring out the venue. The people that bought those services, they're struggling as well, and especially if your venue is free to enter, but there's revenue coming from, say, a cafe or a shop. People might come now and not visit the cafe or the shop, and that's a real challenge for lots of those smaller arts venues and museums. And then I don't think we can forget libraries within the context of kind of London's cultural ecology. Lots of stuff, I mean, you'll be well aware, lots of stuff happens in libraries, lots of it's cultural in that really broadest sense, and people trust local libraries. They're in your neighbourhood, they go to them, they're really important. And lots of, several library services are delivered by charitable trusts working on behalf of the local authority. Those charitable trusts often drive income from other sources, which is being squeezed, or they've got other costs, which are a real challenge at the moment. So if they're doing sport and leisure services as well, there's a real crisis in that sector. So if that's kind of your portfolio of operation, that can be a real challenge. And it puts pressure on, really important local services like libraries.
And Lorna, you've got some experience with libraries, haven't you? Specifically, am I right in remembering that correctly?
In the past, I've definitely worked with libraries.
I mean, have you got any follow-up from what Paul just said?
I would agree. In Waltham Forest, the council runs the library services and has been investing, but we're indeed at that point of saying how can we maximise these very valuable community spaces for cultural use, but also for wider use to support local communities. So yes, and I think it's like everything, we need to try and get as much out of them as possible, so that people have got things on their doorstep that they really need as we go into what feels like another crisis for everybody.
I do want to make sure that we're keeping answers brief, so thank you very much for you've done a great job so far, but we do want to make sure that whatever we get out of this meeting, that we're always referring to what the Mayor can do and how he can support us. Just initially right now, if there's anything that you'd like to say on the particular issues you've just raised, what do you think what actions do you think the Mayor could be doing to support you in your particular area? Do you want to go first, Clara?
So I think what we're seeing on the grassroots level is this, at the moment, it's this issue with sort of insecure tenancy. So on average across the UK, I know we're London focused, but across the UK, there's only about 18 months left on a typical lease. So that's quite a precarious state if you kind of care about the long-term investment into culture as something that needs to be kind of generational. And so I think support from the Mayor, I think in London it will be very interesting to see what we can do on trying to create more longer term leases, or focus on community ownership. I'm outside of Music Venue Trust. I'm helping a venue in Lewisham that's trying to do a community offer share raising project. And so I think in London, because prices of property and prices of venues are so expensive, some kind of support or kind of even maybe a review into how can we do things in kind of on a community level perhaps, to create longer term, more resilient kind of tenancies for our grassroots music venues would be really interesting. I think that's something where we're slightly abnormal in the kind of cultural landscape compared to other, theatres which may be owned by the council or kind of other kind of ways of sort of ownership. For grassroots music venues and the operators who run them, it's quite a precarious thing. If your lease ends, then you have to leave. If your landlord doesn't want to renew the lease, then you have to try and find a new space. If there's no new space available, or the cost to start up a space is very expensive, that can all result in essentially the permanent closure of a lot of these grassroots music venues. So I think some of it, this is kind of big structural and sort of systemic kind of issues, but I think actually having a focus on that would be really interesting.
Thank you so much, Clara. I know that Abdul's just indicated, so Abdul, would you like to add to that, considering that you're from a similar background?
So I think what the mayor could do is provide support funding for more civic activity to take place in small organisations. So we run a coffee morning for refugee and asylum seekers, and at the moment we're funding that, and that coffee morning has been really successful. Getting some support to be able to put that on would be great. With the current cuts across other services, I think theatres and local spaces have a duty to provide other civic services beyond just the theatre and entertainment that they are there for. And so yes, some support around that would be great. Specifically around Tara, we are in for the MPO at the moment, and I think the mayor's office and needs to kind of really get behind some of those small organizations. Just going back to a couple of points raised earlier, some of the larger institutions have had support from freelance fundraising experts. People like Tara, or organizations like Tara, just don't have that capacity and finance, and therefore I think there's a real need for organizations to be identified and support really put behind them from the mayor's office in this next MPO round. I know there's a real drive from the government to level up and push money outside of London, but we're really moving the conversation around diversity and equality and equity forward. And I think there's a real need at the moment to look at the landscape in London. We're getting to a point where we've got a really interesting range of diverse leaders across a range of different organizations, but we now are facing this leveling up agenda, which will mean or potentially mean that we might lose out. So I think there's a real need for some of that work to happen from the mayor's office.
Thank you so much, Abdul. I know that we're running out of time with the amount of time that you have, so I'm going to go straight to Assembly Member Garrett, who's got an additional question. And if there is anything you want to add, do bring it in later.
Yeah, it was just something that Clara mentioned actually about audiences and reluctance to come back and so on, the sort of post-pandemic. I was just curious because we had a similar investigation last year, particularly looking at larger theatre venues, and we found there was a difference between different types of audience. So younger people at that point were much more willing to come out, and older people, for example, classical music concerts, were struggling much more. Is that a pattern that's still happening now, or is there a different pattern, or is it just a complicated picture with no pattern at all?
Yeah, it is complicated, and it does sort of depend on the programming at the venue, and kind of audience demographics. Is the, generally speaking, the programming aimed more towards a kind of an older demographic or a younger demographic? What we're sort of seeing at the moment is generally a 20% kind of drop off, kind of regardless of programming, and I don't quite know why that is. It might be that as simple as people have forgotten that they booked these tickets, a year ago or whatever, or it might be that, you booked it with your partner and you're no longer together and you're not going to go to the gig or something. It doesn't have to be, particularly more complicated than that, but it is a worrying trend when a lot of our venues, the music, at least at grassroots level, when you're putting on artists, but by their very nature, they're not famous at this stage. And so actually you don't make a lot of money from putting on the artist. You make money on the bar that subsidises the music. And so if there's just less people coming out and then less people spending on the bar, it's a really insecure economic model. I mean, to economists, it probably doesn't make sense. But again, it's about the kind of motivations of the people who are venue operators and the fact that they want to be part of an industry that is putting on grassroots and emerging acts. And so when we see this footfall kind of decreasing, or, I was even talking to a venue the other day where it should have been a knockout sellout gig and it was 50% attendance, and it's a bit difficult to see why that's happening, and it's quite worrying.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Very quickly from Assembly Member Bailey, and then Assembly Member Ahmed, if we can just go to Assembly Member Polanski straight after that. That's just for the lack of time. Thank you.
Very quick question. To what extent is this change in attendance behaviour change? Because on the other end of our economy, we've seen people go crazy ordering things on the internet. I spoke to the guy who runs our little local plant thing, and he says he can't sell plants fast enough. People are building their gardens up, basically. So to what extent do we think this is a change in behaviour that may be permanent, or is it just a temporary thing?
I hope it's temporary. I do think, we have lived through a sort of 2.5 year period where people's behaviour has changed. We were told to sort of stay inside and all that kind of stuff, and that probably is going to take a while to when the psychology of that to kind of work itself out. On the other hand, I really hope that as well, when you don't have access to culture, you probably realise how important it is as well, and how much it means to your life. And we saw, particularly with grassroots music venues, a lot of local communities set up crowdfunding pages for their own local music venues, and that kind of local engagement of we really want this place to be here when everything comes back was really encouraging, and so I think there is that love for it. I think it will come back. I think it's just taking longer than we had hoped.
Thank you. Now, I realise that Abdul's raised his hand, and Abdul, Assembly Member Polanski may have some questions that you may be able to answer with the additional response that you've got. So I'm going to move on to Assembly Member Polanski, and Abdul, please come in as soon as you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you all for your answers so far. I should say, before, as a politician, I was an actor working in grassroots venues, particularly with Theatre of the Oppressed and community work. So of all the committee meetings I've been on in my time with the Assembly, I'm really pleased to see this one happening. Abdul, if I can begin with you. While I'm giving you my CV, I worked several times at Tara Arts Theatre, so it's very lovely to have you on the panel. What I particularly want to look at this morning is diversity, particularly within the theatre sector, but across culture more generally. Now, I know straight away that Tara Arts has some of the most diverse audiences in London. When you go somewhere like the National Theatre, though, that diversity is not there. But it's also not there, I think, in other grassroots venues. What do you think's going on? What do we need to do to get more diverse audiences in our cultural venues?
Oh, that's a big question. There's a lot to do. Just a quick one. It's no longer Tara Arts, it's now Tara Theatre.
Apologies.
Rebranded. No, it's all right. I'm just letting everyone know at the moment. I have to do it a lot. Yes, what do we need to do? Like I said earlier, I think there's a really important moment at the, within the sector where we have a range of people coming in at leadership level who have really interesting ideas, and now is the time for the Arts Council to be brave and support those individuals, those artistic leaders, as opposed to make the cuts that we know is needed in London in order to get money out to the regions. I think there's a real need for Arts Council to look at the big organisations, the larger organisations that have capacity and access to other financial resource and funding opportunities, and get behind the diverse leadership, because I think there's this could be a really pivotal moment for us in the conversation around equality, equity, and diversity in our sector. I think there's something around etiquette and awareness and understanding of theatre spaces. Different cultures connect and tell stories in different ways, and being aware of those etiquettes that exist, because I think the British theatre etiquette is a particular etiquette, and whereas there's cultures and audiences who go into theatres and respond and are very much in keeping with what Shakespeare's audiences used to do, and that can be quite intimidating for audiences who are diverse, who are going into spaces and not knowing what that is and what the dress code is, etc. And so I think there's a bit of work there to be done from our end to connect with large organisations to relax some of those thoughts and ideas and create more relaxed performances, which is happening more and more as we in bigger spaces. But I think there is an opportunity here for organisations like Tara to be part of conversations in educating larger institutions in how we diversify our sector. A couple of things really quickly. I'm just aware of time, and I know you asked for short answers. I just wanted to touch on a thing that we spoke about earlier, an analogy. I guess we are speedboats as opposed to the Royal National Theatre, which is a tanker, and it takes a long time to shift and change. And again, that is part of the conversation around diversity. We can shift and change and respond quite quickly to what's going on in the world, whereas the National Theatre takes a year or two to make a decision on what it programs. One other thing in terms of audiences and audience behaviour, we are seeing people come back to the theatre. There's a real appetite for people to get back into spaces. Tara really struggled in our first season when things were when things weren't really clear in terms of the pandemic, and because we're a smaller space, we couldn't do reduced audiences. It just didn't make any financial sense. But what we are seeing is audiences are picking up now, and our next show, Silence, a co-production with Donma, is 70% sold out, and we haven't announced our cast yet. So I think it is what you program and what you're putting on. We're doing a whole season around Partition and 75th anniversary of Partition, and that's going down really, really well, and audiences are coming in, and it is a really diverse audience.
This is really exciting. I think your point on etiquette as well is really well received. I remember I've been in plays with majority black audiences or global majority audiences, and I remember one thing that Tara do particularly well, and also Stratford East actually, is allow the audience to congregate after the show. And I remember there being this almost culture clash of some theatres wanting to kick audiences out because they need to get the next audience in, but actually finding that depending on some cultures, it's actually quite important to be able to congregate and have conversation or eat food or drink afterwards. You mentioned quite a lot about finances there and money, and I totally accept that a huge part of this is about funding. Do you think there's any other aspects to this that aren't about funding where audiences could encourage, theatres or cultural venues could encourage more diversity beyond funding?
Yeah, it's just great awareness, people being educated, taking anti-racism training, organisations bringing in anti-racism training, thinking about the stories that we're putting on, or how important they are. In terms of the importance of not stereotyping, I think Tara, the work that it did in terms of representing the South Asian community in the last 40 years has been amazing. There's a real shift now. I always say our tagline before was when East meets West. East is here, and we're here to stay, and we are West now. So it's about making that really clear, making sure that story is being told in an authentic way, and there's an integrity there around how we tell those stories and how we connect with the younger generation. Because I think in this day and age of Netflix and Amazon Prime, when people can get access to stories quite quickly, why should young people come into theatres? They should come into theatres because we're telling their stories, and we're telling those stories in an exciting and interesting way. So I think, yeah, it's all of those things. I'm working on this opera at the moment called Migrations, and Sir David Poutney, who's kind of leading on that, really interesting, but he's clearly of a generation that doesn't quite understand some of the challenges and issues, and so we're having to really educate him around that. So there's a lot of work to be done around education and connecting with these issues in a variety of different ways, and really understanding the nuance that sits within the conversations around equity and equality and diversity.
That's really exciting. And can I move on to another aspect of that? So for the last 5-10 years, I've been involved with Actor Changer. I've been going to their meetings, Danny Lee Winter's organisation, for more diverse representation on stage and screen. And I don't know if you'd agree, but I feel on screen, in particular, black representation is improving. There's obviously still a huge gap for East Asian representation and Southeast Asian representation. I remember one thing Rufus Norris said at a meeting, and he corrected himself almost immediately, but it did slip out, the artistic director of the National Theatre. We were talking about backstage representation, and he was saying one of the reasons why it wasn't diverse is because he needed the best training and the best quality of training. And although he corrected himself, I feel like that still does run through some of our cultural sectors. I'm just wondering what your opinion is about the cultural workforce.
Yeah, I think we need to improve right across the board. I think there's a real need to train up people to work not just on stage and not just in creative teams and in executive positions, but right across organizations, whether it's marketing, backstage, technical. And I think there's an opportunity for us to come up with a plan that enables young people to enter into the sector and really get a good sense of what these roles are and how they can get training and access to these opportunities. And Tara is hoping to do some of that work. We are hoping, we've got a bit of funding, we've got a bit of money to raise, but we're hoping to run a training program right across the UK, which will take away 30 people each year and run a year-long training program to kind of for access into the art, into theatre and different opportunities and roles that are available within theatre. So I think there's a bit of work to be done around all of that. And we are talking to the National about how they can support us, because they have the resource, they have the building, they have the manpower or the people power. And so how do we attract these individuals and then feed into these larger institutions? So yeah, how do we attract people, feed them into these organizations? How do we signpost them is a really important question. And how do we then support them when they go into these huge tankers, like I said earlier, and they don't get lost and they don't get intimidated and they don't suddenly feel like they don't want to be there anymore? How do we make sure that we keep supporting them and providing what they need?
Thanks for that, Abdul. If I can just ask you a final question, and I'll open up to the rest of the panel. It's around intergenerational diversity. So what role does culture play in bringing young people and older people together and telling kind of those intergenerational stories? And more specifically, do you think there's anything the Mayor or London could be doing more broadly as a city to be telling those intergenerational stories?
Yeah, I mean, it's so important. A partition, what we're doing at the Donmar is Silence, which is an adaptation of a book by Kavita Puri, Partition Voices, Untold British Stories. And that is really all about making sure that those who lived through partition. So Kavita is a BBC journalist who went out for the 70th anniversary and collected testimonies of people who lived through partition. So those lived experiences are there in her book, and now we're sharing them on stage with an audience which is going to be mixed, and those individuals are passing away. You know, we did a project last year, we did a whole season last year around the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh, and again that's really important because the pandemic and COVID had a huge impact on the Bangladeshi community, and a lot of people who lived through that war of independence have now passed away. And so I think the need for bringing together and telling those stories and those histories, which are so important to our communities and to the younger generation, because I think a lot of us just don't know about those moments, those seminal moments in I'm talking about South Asia in particular, but I'm sure, you know, it's the same right across the board, across the Commonwealth, across places which where people come from or have a connection to. So yeah, I think it's really important. How can the mayor do more? I think there's a fair bit that he's doing, to be fair. Like the Eid celebrations were great. I think brought people together in a really interesting way. Let's Do London was really interesting. We were recipients of some Let's Do London funding. We did a piece called Dawat, which went into a whole range of different communities, telling the story of the war of independence of Bangladesh. I think more of that, really. Find more support for things that can happen out in communities which tell those really important stories.
Thank you. That's a really strong community message there, and very well articulated. Thank you very much, and good luck with your rehearsals today as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Adita, if I could turn to you now, obviously the Migration Museum must have diversity at its heart. In terms of your visitors and the people who access you and your cultural workforce, how are you doing with diversity, and how do you think the rest of London could learn or improve?
Yeah, thank you. I think we do a pretty good job in terms of attracting a very diverse audience. I think I have some statistics to share with you. So I think we've been doing audience research with the audience agency through evaluations. At the moment, 43% of our audiences are under the age of 34, just compared to 26% for London museums. 46% of our audiences are Black and ethnic minorities, which is compared with 16%. And we also have twice the rate of visitors from lower socioeconomic groups, so 27% compared with 14% for other London museums. So I think there's a range of reasons why we do attract this kind of very unusual audience. I mean, one is our location and the kind of porous space we're in. It's really attractive to passerbys. It's in the heart of a very diverse community. But it's also what Abdul was, talking about. The stories that we're telling, represent a huge range of people and experiences and voices. In addition to just, what stories we tell, it's really important to us who tells those stories. So engaging our communities in being the storytellers and their voices coming across is really important to us. And, we don't have such a focus on our sort of a permanent collection or objects. Really, our collection is stories. So we do a lot of oral history collection and then work with artists and creative producers to kind of animate those stories in unusual ways and make, good use of interesting technology and immersive experiences. So I think in terms of kind of taking that forward in other organizations and supporting that, I think there has to be a level of kind of funding to allow that risk-taking as well, to support organizations to work with artists who may be unknown, who are from migrant and refugee backgrounds, who are, to be able to offer them opportunities. We've often had artists who we've given residencies to or included in our exhibitions who, had never exhibited before, but then subsequently went on to get big commissions at the IWM or other museums. So, really supporting these grassroots organizations who are discovering or kind of highlighting the work of lesser known artists and communities. And I think, I think really just financial support. It really comes down to that, to kind of allow organizations like ours to have more marketing, to be, on the map in a way that sometimes when, you have the mayor's initiatives, which are great, but it's actually how do you get smaller organizations like ours part of that strategic planning and have an access to that. I'm just thinking about last year, we did a big public engagement campaign around the men's Euros and football, and looking at what the pitch would look like if you didn't have, first, second, third generation migration, and essentially you were left with, 4 players on the field. So we did this great campaign. It had a huge kind of impact online, but I could also see that there were a lot of the mayor's initiatives around the Euros, or even screening, the Euros in Trafalgar Square. So how could our efforts be part of that, to sort of amplify that? And I think there's lots of different ways that could be a model for other smaller organisations.
Thank you. That sparks another question, actually. It's for the full panel. This isn't a test, it's a genuine question. Last year, we had a confirmation hearing for the Cultural and Leadership Board that the Mayor runs, and Moira Sinclair was the chair of it. Now, I've been in this same space for about 2 decades, and I didn't know this board existed. I was wondering if any of the 4 of you knew this board existed, and if you'd had any interaction with it, and if there's anything you think it could be doing more to involve smaller venues at a cultural leadership level.
I'm aware of it. I am aware of it, and I know that they're recruiting at the moment for new members, and I think a new chair as well. What can it do more? I think it can. This recruitment process could be really brilliant in terms of getting some people on there who are from smaller organisations, who can bring some of those thoughts and opinions into the mix alongside some of the larger institutions. Because I think if you look at the current group, there's a lot of people there who are either working in large institutions or are connected to there's less grassroots organisations representation in there. So I think that could be really useful. So maybe that's where you guys could push and get some grassroots individuals in there.
Thank you. It sounds like no one knows a huge amount about it, so maybe that's something
I'm
we
really
could do more.
pleased you raised that, actually, Assemblymember Plansky. We're going to make a note of that. The fact that they all shook their heads was very evident. We're going to be moving on as quickly as we can. So
can I ask one final question before the chair turns my microphone off herself? And that's to you, actually, Clara. So Dita was talking about immersive venues and the fact that unusual spaces can be used for theatre or music. Again, I did a lot of work myself with that, and I saw how that brought communities in who wouldn't necessarily go to the theatre or to a cultural event. What more do you think could happen with music and immersive spaces, and is there anywhere again that the Mayor or London more generally could support with that?
Yeah, so we are seeing an increase in, I guess, the diversity of programming within grassroots music venues. So an example is there's a venue in Sutton called the Sound Lounge, which is a great kind of Americana country music orientated music venue, but they do a lot of training days for kind of people who might want to get involved in sound engineering or just different training skills. They're also kind of vegan based, so they do a lot of kind of events around that. And so what I'm seeing is this kind of move towards music as the core, but a lot of kind of like music's like the core and then satellite events around it. So kind of diversifying what you do in your space and what a music venue can do. And I think that's an interesting thing where, we are, at my level, grassroots music venues are needed because although it's incredible that, it's great for Adele and Ed Sheeran and all these people who are now massive stars, there's also this need for grassroots to cater to niche audiences. So, just off the top of my head, the Black Heart in Camden is well known for being kind of a metal orientated venue. Some of that music is never going to get mainstream. Some of it you'll only ever perform to a front of about 30 people maximum. I would definitely recommend everyone here go to a night at the Black Heart. You hear some very interesting music, might not be your taste, but that's important as well. So it's about allowing these spaces to kind of cater. There is a need to diversify. It is interesting to go to a space that puts on lots of different types of events, but I think also having an acceptance that sometimes it is just going to be niche content, and that has cultural value in and of itself.
That's great. Thank you very much. We've highlighted lots of important factors there. And Abdul, you do want to add to this part of the questioning, and then we'll go straight to Assembly Member Ahmed, who also has just a couple of quick questions for you, Abdul, before you go.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I have questions actually for the panel, but what I will do is start with Abdul, so if he can answer those before he has to go, and then I'll come back to the rest of the panel to ask you to answer these questions as well. Abdul, first of all, if I can also thank you for raising some of... Is Abdul still here?
Yes.
Right, for raising the issue of how important cultural moments are for people. So as a woman of Bangladeshi heritage, you know, to talk about the independence over 50 years ago now of Bangladesh and what that still means to that community that I belong to is really important. So thank you so much for raising that. So my question is, what was the impact of the pandemic? But I'd like you to answer this also in terms of the burgeoning and now present cost of living crisis upon your organisation, including both the artists and the wider workforce. To what extent is Tara now recovering, and what do you think the sector needs to do to make what do you think needs to happen for the sector to make a full recovery?
Okay, so I'll start with Tara, but before I get on to answering that question, the reason why I raised my hand was just going back to the Mayor's Cultural Board. I think a really important part of that board needs to be payment. So if the members should be paid, I think the chair is paid, but the rest of the members are not. And if you want grassroots organizations or individuals running grassroots organizations, being able to pay them, especially people from diverse backgrounds, being able to pay them for their time is really, really important. And I say this a lot about diversity in boardrooms. A lot of people just don't have capacity in time. If you want people from specific communities or those opinions in the room, sometimes you do have to support and find a way to compensate them for their time, because often people are they have quite a lot on. They don't have so I think that's something to take back to the mayor, whether that's an option. Coming back to Tara and your question, so we were it was a really weird time for us because we were in a difficult financial position regardless of the pandemic. We were being really badly funded by the Arts Council. We get 205 or 211,000 from the Arts Council and other organisations similar size to us. Were in receipt of 350, 500,000. You know, there's organisations in receipt of ETT, for example, gets 600,000 a year from the Arts Council. There's a whole bunch of other white-led organisations who are in receipt of much bigger funding from Arts Council England. And so I think we were in a difficult position financially. And when I joined the company, so I've only been there 2 years, just under 2 years. The organisation was always going to have a hiatus, regardless of the pandemic, regardless of COVID. And we've built back, you know, the Mayor's office did intervene, and so did the Arts Council with some intervention support for Tara. And we've really kicked on, you know, we've raised over 600,000 and then built capacity back up. I was the third person because the team had been decimated. People were let go, and there was only 2 people in the team, and I was the third person to join the Tara team. And now we've gone up to 10, about to get an 11th person in. So I think we're in an interesting position. I think we've got a really great proposition. There's a real need for us as an organisation, and we have a really rich history. All of that really works well and works in our favour in terms of getting support from a range of different individuals and connecting with different communities within the South Asian context. I think the sector, at the moment, what we're seeing is a pattern in terms of theatre sector, is a pattern of putting on a lot of low risk work, which is really difficult, of things that are deemed as low risk. And I think we need to find a way to be able to take risk and give artists and organizations and individuals the support they need to take risks, whether that's kind of the stories that are being told, whether that's the form, because I think form is really important. We had a moment where we pivoted to online and we looked at what we could do as theatres online. We need to really understand and take a moment to think about what worked and what didn't when we went into that space, and really think about what the future of an online offer might be, because we might find ourselves in another lockdown in the future. What is that offer? Because I think a lot of people pivoted, went into that online digital space, and there was lots of really great learning. And how do we make sure we disseminate that to as many people as possible? Yeah, I think the live part of it is really about risks and who gets to take those risks. The National can take a bunch of risks. I know they would disagree with me, but I think they can take risks as opposed to us. If one of our shows doesn't do well, we're in a really difficult financial position. So, yeah, I think it's tricky because I think the sector is doing a fair bit. It is shifting and changing, and it is trying to look at new ways of working. I think mental health and awareness of people's mental health in the sector is really important. We've seen a huge fall off of freelance staff. We really struggle to get production managers at the moment, stage managers who have left the sector because we didn't look after them. We didn't respond to their needs when things got difficult. There was no support there for them, and I think we need to build back, and we need to think about how we build back in a way that empowers and enables people, and how we look after those individuals within the work context. Theatre, by its very nature, is quite a hard slog at times. You put in a lot of hours, and you work. You don't get very pay isn't great. And you often do it for the love, but we do need to move away from that idea that people can just do it for the love of an art form. We just don't have people can't survive on just doing things for love. They need money.
I'm just conscious of your time, and if I could interrupt you and leave it on love, which I think is a really good place to leave anything. Just a really important question again from your perspective. Did the pandemic create any opportunities and the growth of grassroots culture in any way, particularly outside of the central London zone? And did your organisation receive any support from government during the pandemic? And if that's the case, was it enough?
Well, we weren't allowed to go in for the support because we were already in receipt of intervention funding. We went in for the final round, but we couldn't. The government funding was really tricky because they needed money spent within specific timeframes, which we couldn't do. So it was hard to get access to support. Opportunities, yes. We had to become other things. I know that the Battersea Arts Centre was a space. I think they were serving food, we started to do other things as organizations, and that was really, really brilliant. And I think it shows us how important our cultural institutions are, however big or small, in terms of the civic role they play in our in our lives. And so I think we really need to hang on to that. I think we shouldn't dismiss our community work, because often community was sat on the side, and community and outreach became the central driving force for cultural institutions during the pandemic. And people embrace that, and I think we need to make sure we continue to embrace that, because too often there's a really clear definition of community and outreach, which sits to the side of the organization, and then the kind of main stage work, which is in the center of the organization, and all of the resources put into the main stage and whatever's going on centrally for the organisation. And I think there's the people who will fare better when we come out of this moment are the organisations that really embrace that and understand how they integrate their community and outreach into all parts of the organisation. So yeah, I think that's the big learning, and the digital aspect that I spoke about earlier.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you,
No worries.
Lorna, for raising the and reminding us of all of one of the best sketch programs ever written, which is Goodness Gracious Me. And if anyone's met my mum, they will know that the scene where she's shoving, you know, the woman shoving samosas into the hospital drip to feed her critically ill son is my mother. So thank you for that reminder.
You should see what my mum can do with an aubergine. Anyway.
Right, thank you. I will hopefully see.
Abdul, thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank
and
you so much,
see you at
Abdul,
some
for
of our
joining
shows.
us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So if I could ask the same questions now, and good morning to the rest of the panel. I asked about the pandemic and now presently the cost of living crisis. And if it's okay, Clara, I'm going to go to you not because you're first, but because you earlier talked about, you gave a really good and pertinent example of a fuel bill, one of the venues which has basically doubled in the last few months. So I wonder if you could address the issue of, you know, what's happened since the pandemic, what sort of support organisations have received, and recovery in the context of the cost of living crisis, and what more can be done.
Sure. So in terms of funding, Music Venue Trust didn't receive cultural recovery funding, but we also made a very conscious choice not to apply for it. So one of our kind of roles as a representative body can at times have to be a critical friend. So we made the kind of conscious decision of if we have to be in meetings with government and all that kind of stuff, actually it's probably better that we're able to say, ooh, that's got that thing wrong, got whatever. So we didn't want to go into the funding for that, but that was a choice that we made. In terms of kind of funding for music venues generally, so we spent a lot of time working with our grassroots music venues, helping them to kind of learn the language of public funding. A lot of them had never applied for public funding before. It really is a kind of skill unto itself, and so learning how to kind of speak the language of a public funder. We helped kind of review applications, coach people, do lots of seminars and training sessions on that. I think, you know, I'm proud to say that was very successful in terms of a lot of our venues did receive Arts Council funding, and I think that made a big difference to it. And I'm hoping maybe going forward there is hopefully an increased confidence within the sector that they could continue to apply for this type of funding and that they would actually be successful. And I think, you know, we're seeing grassroots music venues apply to the Supporting Grassroots Live Music Fund, which is one of Arts Council's fund. I'm not sure that potentially would have happened had some of this training and stuff during the pandemic not happened. And I think in terms of kind of what, I don't want to say opportunities, but what I have seen as a result of the pandemic is a lot of our venues are really just talking to each other a lot more. That wasn't really the case before the pandemic, particularly in the live music industry. It was a pretty competitive environment, and whereas now we're seeing people routinely talking, what ticket price did you put on this one? What was your take here? I need support on this. Would anyone help me on this? And so that's been quite an encouraging thing to see, this sense of, I think, collaboration growing within grassroots music venues. But I mean, I am concerned about the next year or so. I think I think during the sort of pandemic, Music Venue Trust itself, we received funding from the Mayor as part of the Cultural Crisis Fund. That was very good because it meant we could just respond very quickly to the needs. A lot of that kind of longer term funding has now sort of tailed off, really. It was crisis funding, but I would like to sort of see potentially like an institutionalisation of that type of funding, whether it is at kind of London kind of GLA level, but even just kind of across the board, this sort of understanding that now grassroots music venues are within the cultural envelope and they are considered of cultural importance. within the wider kind of context. I'd like to see that continued and that supported. I personally think that one of the ways to do that is through small targeted funds. That's one of the reasons I really like the Supporting Grassroots Live Music Fund. It's quite small, it's quite targeted, it's very specific. It feels manageable when you're trying to kind of write an application, all of that kind of stuff. All of that needs to be understood, because when you run a music venue, and I think it actually goes back to Abdul's point, typically in our sector, it's one or two people running a music venue. So they're doing the door, they're doing the booking, they create the scene. And so the whole kind of apparatus of the culture really comes down to sort of typically one or two people doing multiple jobs at one time. And I think that's one of the reasons, going back to your London committee point, it's quite difficult to get grassroots organisations on those types of boards, because actually they just don't really have the capacity and time to do it when you're having to do 4 or 5 different things within your kind of organisation. And so maybe an understanding of how do we share some of that kind of weight. Is it to do with kind of training people within the organisation that could help kind of take over things? And how do we kind of take some of the lessons that we've learnt through the pandemic, which I think is generally that culture is important. It enriches everyone's lives. It's one of the things that makes life worth living. And so how do we kind of take some of those lessons and make it so that in the next 10 years, there will still be kind of, music venues and theatres and museums. And it becomes a sort of, it's one of our constants that we don't take for granted, I suppose.
Thank you very much. So if I can move this way then. So Aditi, if you'd like to answer that, please.
So in terms of crisis funding, we received some through the sort of Lewisham Council and through the Arts Council. But yeah, I mean, I think some of it is project-based, so actually getting funding that's quite unrestricted and can just be used in whatever way that we need can be sometimes a little bit difficult. And I think Abdul also mentioned that quite a lot of the funding had to be used in a certain time period. So it was restrictive in lots of different ways. But I think the pandemic provides some opportunity for organizations like ours in that, at the moment we occupy temporary spaces, and actually there are lots of vacant retail spaces, lots of vacant other types of spaces that might be available now for smaller grassroots cultural organizations to occupy. So having sort of a commitment to try and link up these organizations with potential spaces would be a really helpful thing that government could help us do. But also I think with the rents rising, just to have some sort of cap on rents and having an agreement that you could occupy spaces for affordable rent would be really important. And I think just having I think part of the pandemic that's challenging is that there's so much uncertainty for organizations like ours, and we're so dependent on landlords and things like that. So just being able to have a bit more certainty would allow us to do planning, because you just don't know where you're going to be.
And how would you get that certainty? What do you think needs to happen to make that certainty happen?
I think it's for our organization in particular, I suppose, it's just having a commitment to helping us find a space, a permanent space, and to make that space affordable for us to be in. I think that would be the key, really. I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Paul.
Thank you. The first thing I'll say about the impact of the pandemic was just how massively proud I was to work within the cultural sector, because you've heard several examples already of how the cultural sector stepped up to support communities, and what Battersea Arts Centre did around feeding people was one thing, but they didn't forget the core mission as well. So they were providing creative packs to local kids, so even in lockdown people could be creative, and I'm sure everybody's got their own stories about how engaging with arts and culture helped them get through that time. And artists, cultural organisations, people working in the sector felt they had a responsibility, and I think that's something that we're really proud of the sector for doing. I think in terms of the impact and the impact running into kind of the cost of living crisis, clearly it was huge and significant and negative, parts of the sector have been lost as we've gone through that. I mean, we did put some, in the very first weeks of COVID, put some emergency funding out there for both individuals and for organisations, which was very quickly snapped up and helped people get through that initial period of the first lockdown. But equally, the Cultural Recovery Fund, which people have referred to, it was almost £2 billion. That was a significant investment. A large chunk of that money went into London, and that played a big part in making sure that the sector came through. However, when you get a big chunk of money like that, and it's coming out alongside, CJRS and the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, these are big, chunky government funds being operated at speed. They don't serve every single need. And while we did get some things right within it, so we were talking to DCMS and to government about, along with Music Venues Trust, about the particular issues around grassroots music venues, and we did manage to get some of that money out the door early before the rest of the Cultural Recovery Fund happened. There will have been other bits of the sector which will have missed that, and I think one thing that we can do is we can look at the experience of the last few months and see where people, some things that Abdul was talking about in terms of particular skill sets within the sector that have been lost. Can we collect that evidence that we know if we face this kind of challenge again, that we're in a position to put the appropriate support in place? I think thinking about the recovery and it's playing into the cost of living crisis, I mean, there has been a recovery. Audiences have gone up faster in London than elsewhere in the country, and that's fantastic. However, it is, as some of the other panelists have said, it is patchy and it is different to what it was before, and it's still a recovery. So young people have come back, but we're seeing different patterns of behaviour. So people are probably buying tickets a bit later than they would, a bit less advance. Can play havoc with your cash flow if you're a small organisation. And then, as Abdul was saying, there's been some issues around staff retention and particular skill sets. And when you play that into the cost of living crisis, the recovery is clearly, the recovery from pandemic is clearly going into a really challenging time. I don't think we've seen how that will play out yet, because while we've got the examples, I can think of examples from the museum sector as well, that people's energy bills have doubled and trebled. A lot of that's down to when your particular arrangement comes to an end. So there's an element of unpredictability as people's individual organisations' circumstances shift. And a lot of these things, I mean, most of these things aren't in the control of the cultural organisations or in the Arts Council. So if we're looking at fuel, but we're also, we're looking at, if you're deterring, which is a really important driver for income for organisations in London, including grassroots organisations. The costs of touring are going to go up significantly. We all know how much petrol and diesel costs. That's an immediate cost. So organisations are going to be faced with some really hard choices very soon as to where they spend what is a decreasing stock of capital to draw upon.
Thank you. Lorna, did you have anything to add to that?
So I resonate with what's been said across the panel. I think, and again, picking on what other people have been saying, that there's obviously been, I think, more confidence in outdoor productions. We had 20,000 people attend our Jubilee outdoor street party, so there's ways of working as well there is trying to bring confidence back in the way that we deliver things, which isn't possible for everybody. But in terms of opportunity, and I think this probably is because of Borough of Culture, a greater understanding of the power and the value of culture in addressing those wider issues, that culture has featured, I think, more strongly than it might otherwise in terms of the borough's recovery. And I can speak from a local authority perspective, but it's been a really core part of our high street recovery and understanding that culture can animate the high street, and ultimately that's enabling the money, different money to get to those grassroots organisations. The same that we've been working with the local plan and making sure again that there's workspace provision and that policy really enables people to get opportunities for developers funding. So it's using that wider opportunity, the wider resources, and making sure that there are pathways for cultural organisations to receive the money that otherwise they just wouldn't have been eligible for. And similarly, cultural jobs have been part of our borough's jobs recovery, again, and working right from schools to understand what the importance of creative jobs are, for parents to understand the importance of creative jobs so they don't tell their young people to go and get a proper job. But, you know, and then those pathways, and we're also working with Soho Theatre and other organisations to understand where are their big skills shortages so that we can work with our diverse local populations and help to start to address some of those workforce issues as well.
Thank you very much. I think we've all had the proper job conversation with our parents. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member Ahmed. We're moving on to Assembly Member Clark, and we have exactly 1 hour to go, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair. I think that was my cue to keep it brief. Clara, we've talked about quite a bit about the pandemic and also the cost of living crisis, but I'm just wondering about the impact of Brexit on the smaller cultural arts sector in London. Has it created challenges or opportunities for smaller cultural bodies that are different to those experienced by the larger, more established institutions?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because, you know, obviously at a sort of grassroots DIY level, kind of cross-European touring is very important. You get in a van, you go across and you bring your merch and you play there. And then likewise back in the UK. So I think we're starting to see some of the impacts. I think obviously that was delayed sort of by the pandemic and sort of when touring didn't happen. So we are sort of starting to see some bands having issues, like UK bands having issues trying to kind of play across Europe. What type of kind of carnets do you need? What type of forms? All that kind of thing as well. It's difficult to say kind of what's the sort of long-term impact at the moment. I think in some ways what I have seen, at least in the last few months, is that there's a willingness, at least within the UK, to do longer tours. Actually, that's quite interesting. So normally in the last 5 years or so, it was quite common to see a kind of grassroots tour that might hit 8 to 10 venues maximum, but now you're seeing actually bands really hungry to play 30-date tours again. And I think maybe that's probably actually an effect of the pandemic, of not being able to do your job as if you're an artist. You just want to get out there and tour as much as possible. So I think I'm still sort of waiting to see the full impacts of Brexit on touring. I think it will definitely make things harder in the short term. Whether we then how we work those things out, I'm not too sure. But we are starting to see some of those issues filter through, and the sort of ease of what it previously was isn't there.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member Clark. We're going straight to Assembly Member Bailey, and then Assembly Member Sheikh will be doing a supplementary straight after.
Morning, everybody. Can I adjust my question to Laura in the first instance? What support do local authorities in London provide for small cultural organisations in their boroughs?
So the immediate thing that comes to mind is that we have a grant fund, and that grant fund was something that we've had for a while, but we really developed it through Borough of Culture. And some of the things that have been talked about in the fact that we really try and make sure that some of that is targeted to the groups that we've been unable to reach in the past. But fundamentally, I think the importance of it has been that we've had a community panel who make the decisions on which projects actually get the money as well. So that again brings a real diversity of projects. So one is about the direct money through grants. Certainly through the pandemic, and we're continuing that, is just to be a source of trusted advice and information. Where there were additional restriction grants, we could influence the team who were doing that to try and make sure that it was cultural organisations, again, who might not have been used to applying for those grants, so that they could access that money. And it's also about workspace as well, to make sure that there's affordable workspace. We have a creative enterprise zone in Black Horse Road in Waltham Forest. And again, it's making sure that there's a real awareness of what that means and constructing it in a way that enables local organisations to sort of survive, but eventually hopefully grow as well.
Thank you. You made a comment about you have a community panel that selects who receives funding. Who shortlists? Is that done by the council?
Yes. So the shortlisting is done. Does this meet the criteria? And there are criteria with the grants, and then the long list of everybody who fits those criteria goes to the panel. The panel is trained in how do you look at criteria and grant applications. And one of the sort of benefits from that is people who were on the panel, and now people can apply to be on the panel, because again you have to be so careful you're not selecting people who give you the answer that you may think you want. They now realise what they need to do when in their own arts organisations they're applying for grants, and it's given them insight in how do you put a good application together.
Thank you. I really appreciate the idea of not selecting people who give you the answer you want. As someone who's a youth worker, I'm very used to things being presented as if they're level playing field, and they're not. Another sort of small question: is it easier to fund a sort of ostensibly community-based arts project than it is one that has some kind of commercial aspect? Because we're talking about music venues, and they are very important, but is it harder to fund them because they may have a commercial aspect to them?
I would say it's definitely easier to fund one there's not the commercial aspect to, but we've just done some grants for Fellowship Square, and that people are selling tickets, because I think there has to be a recognition that sometimes having everything free at the point of entry isn't sustainable, and I think we've got to have grown-up conversations about what's sustainable. How do you ensure that people aren't excluded when there's a fee? So it's not an either or, but yeah, it can sometimes you have to make more of a case to support organisations that are seen to be commercial.
If I could quickly jump in on that point, because it's really interesting. So what we've seen in the last few years is actually a movement from within our grassroots sector of moving towards kind of not-for-profit status, community interest companies, things like that, where there's a kind of recognition, at least at the grassroots level, what you're doing is really a kind of not-for-profit activity, particularly when you're kind of putting on emerging artists that are very, very early on in their career. And so I think actually it kind of going forward, giving advice on how you might want to either move towards not-for-profit status like charities, or a community interest company, or something that kind of aligns more with the ethos of delivering kind of community activity. Because I think if you speak to a lot of grassroots music venue operators, that's sort of the world that they see themselves in, and then getting them to realise, oh no, that does mean them as well. You can move into that kind of bracket and realise that actually you don't just have to be a limited company. There is more options towards that, and then sometimes that might result in being better understood by funders, I suppose.
Thank you. I just wondered, because I can see that I used to run a community organisation, and we were fully community, but you'd see people who wanted to do things that are innovative, but they would have to charge, or they came from a slightly different start point, and it excluded them, which I thought was a shame, because I think charity doesn't have to be 100% charity. If you start, I mean, we should try and encourage people in business to act charitably in their goings on. Let me move on to my second question. Do London grassroots music venues face specific challenges in relation to licensing, and what can be done to address these challenges? Obviously, Clara, I'm coming to you, and I say this because as someone from the black community, we've seen many other communities receive support in order to keep their venues going, and it's been an absolute desert in the black community for many, many years. All of our, what I would argue, culturally important venues have gone, and they show no sign of returning. So is licensing something that we could maybe... Could it be done here at City Hall? Is it being done successfully at council level already? What would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sort of kind of layperson in licensing, in that I'm not an expert, but in my role as the venue support manager, I can see more often than not it's at a kind of council level where the licensing department doesn't really interact with the environmental health department, which doesn't interact with the planning department, and that all creates kind of friction and pressure in how you then sort of run your business. And I think some of it also goes down to how can you create sort of more understanding and trust between sort of venue operators to approach their local kind of licensing department, ask them, okay, well, what does this term actually mean? Or, okay, we've had a noise complaint, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically going to be a negative experience or anything like that. It's kind of learning how to navigate some of those systems, and I think actually at a mayoral Greater London Authority level, some guidance on that, and even just some kind of a way of sort of integrating some of that understanding across those different kind of departments would be really, really helpful, because I think at the moment it was really lacking. I'll give you an example. In Hackney, they had a really interesting cultural programme where it was kind of grants for putting on events, and then at the same time there was one venue that had to get their sort of tens removed for the very funding that was given by the council. And so it was an interesting one where it's like clearly those two departments just hadn't sort of talked to each other about what was going on there, and so that can sometimes create pressure that is quite difficult to navigate, particularly if you come from a kind of perspective where you think, oh, maybe you're nervous to actually kind of confront some of those kind of officers or departments or whatever, because you haven't had good experiences in the past, you know.
Yeah, as you say, do you think there's any scope to centralise licensing, maybe at this level, at regional level? Do you think there's any scope for that?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I think it depends on maybe even guidance or recommendation. I mean, for me, what I would be quite interested in seeing at a licensing level is maybe just a directive from the GLA that says to all the boroughs, actually, you should all be having meetings with your cultural operators once a quarter or something, to start fostering that kind of relationships which currently don't happen, and I think getting venues to sort of understand that actually, you can go to your licensing officers or your environmental health officers or your planning department, but I think maybe that will take initiatives from the Greater London Authority as well to sort of make some of those things happen.
Yeah, because I think one of the things the mayor did get right is the idea of the agent of change has to cater for that change, because often a licensing is just seen as enforcement. So if you're setting up a venue and you're small, you don't want to say to people what you're doing just in case they switch you off very early on. Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Sheikh?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And good. I think we're still in the morning, aren't we? Good morning, panel. It's great to be joined by you. It's been really fascinating to hear your perspectives on how we protect and promote and uplift grassroots culture and the wider cultural industry. I wanted to build on the line of questioning from Assembly Member Bailey, which I think is really pertinent, about, I think particularly looking at the black community and how, especially those who produce music nights, have had to navigate that scene for quite a few years. And I wanted to draw particular attention to the 696 form that I'm sure you're aware of, but at the time was a form by the Metropolitan Police that meant you had to detail the ethnicity of your clientele, which you would have thought rang alarm bells in its formation. And it was great to see that Sadiq Khan scrap that form in 2018, because anecdotally through friends, or generally I think from very clear feedback, it felt like it it felt like it targeted the black community specifically in black music nights. So I just wanted to get the panel's thoughts on other sort of, whether it's administrative and bureaucratic barriers that you think the black community, or more broadly the BAME community, which is not a term I like, but it serves a purpose when we're discussing things, face, I think, trying to put on, diverse events. Any recommendations consequently? If all right, I think I'll start with Clara.
Could you summarise the question a bit?
I think building on the experiences of what we heard around how the black community felt particularly targeted with the 696 form. Do you feel like the barriers that they were facing at the time have been overcome? Do you think there are more? Do you think there's still... Sorry, I tried to summarise and I've added more questions. Do you think there's a hangover of those barriers? Is that still embedded in the institutional... whether that's through the licensing that's permitted at local council levels? Do you think that that's still embedded?
Yeah, I think it also goes back to... A few years ago, Music Venue Trust, in collaboration with the GLA, put out a book called How to Open a Grassroots Music Venue and How to Run a Grassroots Music Venue. And our kind of aims with that was to simplify at least some of the understanding around licensing, planning, EHOs, what you should do. And we did 2 weeks ago, again in collaboration with the GLA, training sessions. One of them was how to build stakeholder relationships with your local authority or local council. And what we saw in doing that meeting, I think it maybe in our sort of sector, particularly if you get a kind of licensing letter, you automatically assume it's enforcement action. I mean, I imagine they're probably kind of standard template letters, but when you receive them, they can read incredibly, quite scary, to be honest. And so I think that kind of creates an atmosphere where people don't really feel like these things are approachable. And so I think there is a lot of work that still needs to be done on that. And so I don't think we're at this place where we've had a huge improvement on that, if I'm honest.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if I could actually come to yourself, Paul. I don't know. I think perhaps you might have some perspective.
Can I just interject? We are slightly running out of time. But do you mind if Paul writes to us with an answer, or do you want to hear that now?
I'll be honest with you, I would like to hear it now. Thank you.
Okay, and I can follow up writing as well, so I'll be really quick. I mean, I think I'll give a perspective as a funder, rather than some of the kind of regulatory stuff, because I think other people have got more expertise in that than me. And I think there's a couple of things that I'd highlight there. So one, as a funder and as a public body, we have a responsibility to represent the diversity of this country, and we need to be constantly vigilant as to how we're doing that and listening to challenges that come in. So some of the things that Abdul was saying before, that's clearly a debate we're involved in across the cultural sector, and that's a challenge that we welcome and we need to act on. The job isn't done, and it's not going to be done, and there's a lot still to do. But if I give some examples of how, as a funder, we've responded through some of that listening. So we did a particular piece of work looking at, I mentioned the match funding requirement for our funding. We looked particularly at communities across London where applications were coming from, and what were the reasons why you fell at particular hurdles. We looked at the match funding one, and if you're from a Black, Asian, or ethnically diverse background, the match funding appeared to be a particular challenge that you face. So we looked again at that restriction within our funding, and I think practical changes like that can make a difference in terms of, because that leads forward into who gets to work in the sector and questions around programming. So it's a very specific example. And then I think another area I'll pick up on that just from us as a funder, and I don't think this is a recommendation to the authority and the mayor, but it might be about best practice that we could explore together. It's thinking about questions of governance and workforce. Now, how do you change that within a cultural organisation, and particularly in a smaller grassroots organisation where there might be a lack of capacity to deal with those challenges, no matter how well intentioned the organisation is in wanting to see a change. We can wield some sticks. So in terms of our coming national portfolio, of which we'll announce funding decisions later this year, we will be requiring organisations that get money from us to set targets for governance, for workforce, to be representative of communities that they serve. But you can't just wield the stick, you've got to encourage people as well. And I think some things that Abdul was talking about in terms of how you would pay people, how you might get people representing particular communities on decision-making and advisory structures, like the panel we were talking about, those things can make a difference as well. And how you support that capacity is very much something that I think organisations like the Greater London Authority, local government, the Arts Council can collaborate on to put some of that kind of positive capacity building to go alongside the kind of standards that are expected.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you so much. An important question. We're moving on to Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much. Paul, if I could keep on the conversation about funding, it's obviously, for obvious reasons, been very present this morning. Now, the Arts Council funding predominantly has focused on central London, including the Cultural Recovery Fund. What's the rationale for this?
So in terms of, there's a fact about whether the sector in London is located and where the largest organisations in London are located. So if we're talking about grassroots organisations, yes, there are many in central London and in the London boroughs, but there are fewer of those larger organisations outside. So in terms of organisations which receive the largest grants, so in terms of where the cash will go, that is clearly into central London. I think this is a situation that we want to see changing over time. We want to make sure that we're supporting cultural opportunity across London, and we recognise that in various parts of outer London and outer London boroughs there is less Arts Council funding, which leads into a less strong cultural ecology, and we want to be shifting that over time. We've made some moves in that direction already, and I think we've got a clear sense, thinking about the representations of the kind of bits of the sector we've got on the panel, who our partners are within those locations to grow the cultural sector, grow the cultural ecology in those places. Clearly, it's going to be more challenging for us to be able to do that in our coming investment round, given the requirement from government upon us to redistribute some funding from the capital outside of London to support levelling up. That's a very clear government directive that we have received. As a public body, we have to respond to that. But that ambition to support the grassroots sector across outer London remains. We've nominated 5 priority places, which we announced a little while ago, where we have an aspiration to increase our investment over time, and through the course of this investment round, all of those places are in outer London. And we've also extended some of our programmes, which are about providing cultural opportunity in a sustainable way, really building on the communities and grassroots organisations and local partnerships. So our Creative People and Places programme, which is a national programme, there were 2 partnerships funded in London as part of that programme. It's now 6. So we've got a clear direction of travel, which is to support those sorts of organisations. But at the same time, London is, as well as having local ecologies, there's a London-wide ecology, and those larger organisations are part of it. They do work with grassroots organisations. They do work to support touring, both in and out of London, and that's something as well that we want to work with them on to see them doing more.
Thank you. On levelling up, what impact do you think this will have on London's grassroots culture?
So it will. I mean, the first thing is it will make for some challenging challenges for the Arts Council as we make our decisions in the coming funding round. I think it will clearly restrict the potential to grow the cultural sector within London off the back of Arts Council funding, but we shouldn't forget that it's not just Arts Council funding that leads to growth in the cultural sector. So one of the things I think that we have to do is to be smart about the partnerships we're in, and then I think there is a conversation with the Mayor and the Greater London Authority and the Deputy Mayor for Culture about how we engage strategically with this body operating regionally to make sure our funding works most effectively. I think we have to be we have to make sure that we deliver against our commitments to those priority places, to make sure that we're increasing investment in those places over time. And I think what we have to also bear in mind as well, and this is something we haven't forgotten, is that our commitment within this current funding round to have a more diverse portfolio, that exists within London as well. So we want to see more organisations that are led by a more diverse range of people. So we'll be looking to bring new organisations into the portfolio. We want to see those organisations that have ambition provided with extra support as well. Now, that will clearly create a challenging situation for us as a funder to deal with, and I can't answer your question completely because we don't make the decisions until October, but that's how we're kind of setting up ourselves to deal with the particular challenges of levelling up in front of us. I think it's important to recognise that there's still going to be over £400 million invested in London, so this will still be the world-leading centre of the UK's cultural sector with significant support from the Arts Council.
Thank you, and I'm going to end it there, but Chair, perhaps we could ask if you could write to the committee once that decision's made in October, just to outline how specifically we can protect those cultural venues outside of central London too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're definitely going to be keeping to time, so well done everyone. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you. So way of shouting out the London Borough of Lewisham, which I'm a councillor, and obviously with the London Borough of Culture. But well, I'm not going to suggest that Aditi that you fill that spot. But any contributions that you might want to add to this conversation, please do. And this is just about the London Borough of Culture and the impact on the borough and the benefits that it brings. So I'll start with Lorna, and I will come to you, DT, if you did want to contribute from a Lewisham perspective, seeing as we're the London Borough of Culture this year, but also any of the other panellists. So what has the social and economic impact of the London Borough of Culture programme been in your borough, and how have you measured this impact? So if I start with you, Lorna.
Thank you. So we were first London Borough of Culture in 2019, and I should add we did actually liaise with the Cultural Leadership Board during 2018 and 2019. So Borough of Culture brought 500,000 visits to the borough, we put on over 1,000 events and activities, we being the borough, and 85% of households were engaged. We measured the economic impact from our 10 highlight events, and that was estimated at bringing £4.1 million into the local economy. So we did a lot of work to engage businesses, hospitality businesses, creative businesses, and just high street businesses. In terms of ongoing impacts, we also we were patting ourselves on the back because we engaged 1,000 volunteers from a really fantastic diverse range of backgrounds and ages as well, quite a lot of young volunteers linked to some of our other programmes. But then COVID hit, so we'd sort of been saying for some time that the brilliance of culture in addressing many issues. So we were faced with a challenge, but I believe because of Borough of Culture, we met that challenge very well. You were saying fleet of foot, and our local organisations really were. The volunteers boosted from 1,000 to 3,000 and became the real cornerstone of the borough's response to supporting its local communities. And although they were different people, some of them were different people, the structures and knowing how best to work with volunteers actually was practised through Borough of Culture. The networks, both the local networks and the creative networks, really came into their own. Again, through the funding that we mentioned, we thought, actually, who knows best on how to support local communities, the people in them. So again, within about 6 weeks, we've got a new grant programme out there called our Virtual Culture Programme, and a really fantastic, innovative way of working. So lots of digital online, but virtual also meant doing things on the radio. Our Black Horse workshop made kite kits, and using zero-emission bike deliveries delivered 1,000 kite kits right across the borough, and then using social media. So there was lots of really innovative ways of working through what was, the most extraordinarily difficult times. And also just talking about empowering communities, which can be sort of sound tokenistic if we're not careful, but I think it embedded within the council, the wider council, both the value of culture, but also how amazing it is when you empower communities properly. So there were a number of initiatives, for example, what's it called? A civic forum on looking at race hate crime, and how could the borough and its community address that, and what actions, and the council took on board the actions which were entirely from a representative group from the community. So I think it fundamentally changed the ways of working. And some of the other things I mentioned, getting policy changed in the local plan, really setting culture centre stage, has meant that various departments across the council are actually then working in different ways with the communities. One last thing I'd like to mention is within Borough of Culture there was a performance called East Side Story, and that was a local organisation, Catalyst in Communities, working with 22 local young people who, let's say, were from vulnerable backgrounds, at risk of falling off the rails, but they worked and developed their own story, like you were saying, and put on performance about their own story. Probably the first time their parents had been proud of things in their life, but also the powerful messages that sent to the people who worked in social care, looking after young people. I'm sure there was somebody with a calculator, because somebody said it was better than 10 years mental health support, that actually this fundamentally changed those people's lives. So I think it had those things which are sort of the breadth and the depth of that, which is now continuing. And some of it, I suppose it's good that those things are continuing without culture's impact. They've now got their own pathways.
Fantastic. I mean, you're really setting a very high bar for Lewisham to meet. That is a really fantastic achievement. And I think 85% of households engaged is a very aspirational figure. I just wanted to congratulate you on the work done, because I think that's a really proud record. And a good friend of mine, Ahad, who helped set up Dialed In, I think that was part of the London Borough of Culture, which celebrated South Asian art, and it was a historic event, I think, sort of first time in London.
Back. They've got some great funding.
Third time running, I think. So I think the legacy will really live on. I think if I kind of translated that question to you, Aditi, if you did feel like sort of answering it, is how would you like to be engaged, I guess, in Lewisham as a kind of local stakeholder that's incredibly important to the borough? in the forthcoming programme for the London Borough of Culture in Lewisham?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're incredibly proud to be in Lewisham during its Borough of Culture year, and to be, yeah, it's such a fantastic community. We because we've had temporary homes elsewhere in London. I think the kind of the community feeling, the embrace from the local community has just been to a completely different level. And I think maybe it's because people, have felt like outsiders and there's a real spirit. So I think, it's a great place to be. And I think there's a huge amount of creativity and activities happening. We've received, we're not, we're sort of involved in that. We are in conversations with the council, and we've received like little bits of money to be able to highlight the work of local artists, but we're not, in any way really involved in the planning of it as much. But I think because of our location and where we are, people assume that we are much more involved in the planning of it. So we've become a bit of a sounding board for local organizations and artists. And so I think that's maybe a unique position where we've gathered a lot of feedback from, local people and how they want to be involved. But I think just having, being more linked up and having a better understanding of all the different activities that are going on. I think that's a recurring thing that a lot of our visitors ask us about. Maybe just, having a lot, a bit more knowledge of everything that's going on. And I would say it's a really important question about legacy and how do we build on this and make sure that we're telling these stories about the diversity of Lewisham's communities, and that there's funding to keep doing that going forward, so that like building on what you've done in your borough, being able to do that would be brilliant.
Amazing. And I'll ask a final question before I pass back over to the chair, which I think kind of wraps up a little bit of what you were just saying at the end about engaging diverse communities. And Lorna, this is, I guess, what kind of concerted policies or kind of action plans did you use to engage a diverse community in your area? Again, I think it would be helpful to begin to build that best practice for London Borough cultures, but also additional to that, did you find that people outside of your borough would come to visit for events?
So if I could do the last one first, people definitely brought in people from outside the borough, and that was allowed, especially if they brought money and spent it at the local shops. But what our ambition was that we'd be the sort of centre stage for London, but we soon realised that actually we had to get it right locally. And that's what happened really is well, I don't know that we quite got it right, but we got better as we got on with it. But get it right locally, and that then is the power that brings people to come and find out what's going wrong or going on, rather than the other way round. And in terms of diversity, we couldn't measure everything, but we did try and, through surveys, in-person surveys, we did try and measure the diversity, not just of the audience, but we try to get participation rather than just audience, and also of those organisations involved and the supply chain to those to what was going on. So our focus was local, but and I'm going to go back to the grants programme again, because that was the way that we could really be very agile. That I would like to say it's by good planning, but it was probably because of the time scale we were on. We evaluated every quarter, but that meant that because we hadn't completely sorted out our programme for the full year, we could then, for example, we found after the first quarter, we have quite a high Polish population, and we weren't getting very little interaction. So we sought out somebody who could sit on the panel, who was from a Polish film background. They could use their networks and encourage people to apply. So we had a very iterative approach. There were still people who felt left out because the grants didn't fit with what they were going to do. So I think we, as much as we could, we had very much an open door, and we were out there, we were having conversations, formal and informal, and trying to understand where sometimes those invisible barriers were. We now encourage people to apply for grants, for example, through video, not just through a written form.
Good. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for those answers. And I hope those who are listening will be coming to Lewisham for the London Borough of Culture events. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We don't have to live in Lewisham to love Lewisham.
I couldn't agree more. Let's get that on a T-shirt.
And on the point about the Migration Museum, it's such a shame it hasn't got a permanent base, because it's such a valuable museum and the stories that you're telling, there's no better time right now for those stories of migration to be talked about on a wider level, beyond Lewisham, beyond London. So I'm definitely putting that into the... Oh, okay. So I'm going to go very quickly to Assembly Bailey, then Assembly Clerk, and then Assembly Member Garrett.
A very specific question for your museum. Would it be better to have a permanent base or permanent funding? Because it strikes me that your activity is a London-wide activity. It'd be great to have you there if you could move around. So is it more about the base or the funding?
I think base first, to be honest. It sounds like a really compelling idea to have a migration museum that migrates, but it's, and we absolutely, have ambitions to have a kind of hub, but then presence, not only in London, but outside of London, across the country, because it's a national story. But I think just in terms of being able to, it's completely draining on our staff to have to keep moving, and the cost of putting up and making a space good and putting up exhibitions. So and then being able to kind of engage with the local community and build, because those relationships take time, as you know, to build those relationships. It's not possible to do if you're just constantly on the move. So I think we do need a base where we can kind of operate from, and I think the funding will kind of follow that probably.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Lorna, this is just to you. I'm a councillor in the Borough of Barnet who've sadly never bid to be the Borough of Culture, and listening to all the wonderful things and having witnessed Brent right next door to us being the Borough of Culture and having such a vibrant year even during the pandemic, it's really inspiring. Obviously, you may know Barnet is now under new administration, and I'm just wondering, would you recommend Borough's bid for this?
Definitely. I mean, it's a roller coaster, but definitely, because actually, as I know, cities of culture have found, is if the bidding is done correctly and the bidding is done as I would say, it's Borough of Culture, not Council of Culture. So if the bidding is done properly, that brings people together, and we've heard all about the importance of collaboration. I don't know why the arts world always seems to be quite competitive, but the bringing people together, collaboration. And even within the council, because it was a real cross-council thing, people talk about members of staff feeling better unity with the borough, with the council, better ambition. So yes, yes, yes.
Thank you, and thank you, Assembly members. I think we've got ample time now for Assembly Member Garrett's questions.
Thank you very much. Just sticking with the question about the London Borough of Culture, which is coming to my patch in Croydon next year. It's sort of a lessons learned, I suppose, for you, Lorna, although other people may would indicate if you wanted to come in as well. I suppose it was about what support you had from the Mayor's culture team and what recommendations you would make to them on how they could better support future either bids or, in particular, winning bids to make that a success.
So there was quite a lot of support during the bidding process, and because it was the first round, there was quite a lot of collaboration just to sort of refine and define exactly what things meant. So I say that I would definitely say that the bidding process itself, that there's advice on how you can do that, so that the community engagement doesn't start once you've won, because you're sort of starting off from the wrong position there. Lessons learnt, time for us was a real pressure, but I think on reflection that was quite good. It enabled decisions to be made more quickly. And when we're talking about legal procurement and all those sorts of things, we had to just find new ways through because we just didn't have the time to do those things. The GLA, the culture team at the GLA held sort of speed dating events where they put you in contact with different organisations across London to try and develop those partnerships. I think that was useful. And I think there does exist a network. So I've spoken to, I think the person has now left, but I've spoken to colleagues in Croydon about, sharing the learning that we've had, the good bits and the not so good bits. So yeah, I think it's definitely about partnerships, and I think there's probably a lot we learnt in terms of how we evaluated things. You know, it was quite difficult to evaluate the impact on businesses, you know, and just being those sorts of very practical things about how we delivered the year.
Sorry, I missed my mic button. On the evaluation question, actually, that might be something for you to write to us rather than go into at length now. But I'm always quite interested to understand how we've measured what we think the impact was, because it's very easy to spend a lot of money and to assume that it's all worked well, and sometimes you find that some of it's worked well and some of it hasn't. So then, you know, one of the lessons learned is to do more of the stuff that worked well. And actually, on that point, what was this? You know, what's been the sort of long-term legacy? Because again, I think one of the concerns I have for Croydon is that it's not a one-year thing. I'd like to see, and I know a lot of local residents would like to see something established that can then continue. You know, maybe a concert in a park that is the first annual concert in that park, something like that. So what have the longer-term impacts been, and has there been anything that was unexpected or surprising in that?
I've mentioned a few of them. So, for example, the volunteers and how they came into their own through COVID, because obviously 12 weeks after the end of our Borough of Culture, we went into lockdown. So the legacy that might have been planned, but we've a lot of it is about investment. So during 2019, the council had announced that it was going to invest in a 1930s Art Deco cinema known as the former EMD, and that's going to open next year with Soho Theatre, Walthamstow, brand new theatre, which again will absolutely change the centre of Walthamstow. So that was a commitment, a long-term commitment made. And I actually think fundamentally it was a better understanding and raised the profile of culture in the council as well as in the borough, but it was in the council, and the council clearly has a huge influence on how it structures the borough and how it supports the borough. So I think that was it, and that came from the strong leadership within the council, both political and chief exec, and you know, there was a lot of support throughout from the GLA.
Okay, that's great. So my final question, actually, which I think is the final question, which I'll go along. I'll start with Aditi on the end, which is about the sort of big question, and probably some of these things will have come up already. So I'll suggest that you bullet point things that have come up already. But just a sort of final thought on what is it that you think, in particular the mayor, because obviously this is the mayor's purview here, could be doing to better support culture, particularly outside of the big, you know, well-known venues and the central London venues?
So I think to start with is just more awareness raising of the fact that these venues, organizations exist, putting that out on the map, whether that's through, marketing or digital efforts, or making marketing available, in-kind marketing available to these organizations. I think secondly, it's about, involving these smaller grassroots organizations in decision makings, in cultural leadership boards, as we talked about. I think, just kind of having a better access to the mayor's office, because I think a lot of us small organizations find this incredibly frustrating to try and get through to people, and actually have that a dialogue there. And there is a lot of, we've actually been really lucky. The mayor has visited the museum. He uses as a backdrop for a press conference that was held when President Trump was visiting. But actually translating that support for the museum into financial support and other kinds of practical support is, I think, what we would really help.
Thank you. If it's any consolation, we found it quite difficult to get access to the Deputy Mayor as well, because she's not here today. Paul, did you want to... so the broad question about what could the Mayor or the Mayor's office or the GLA be doing?
Yeah, so I think it's about where you've kind of got the ability, the Mayor and the authority have the ability to act. So I think there's something around planning. We've heard today about the challenge of finding a home. And we look at what's happening on our high streets and the increasing vacancies there. I don't think we're talking meanwhile space anymore. I think we're talking about permanent shift in how our high streets operate. So what's the best way that the London Assembly, with its planning powers, can help organisations like the Migration Museum, but also in doing so help those town centres and those high streets to change for the future. And that really will be grassroots, because people go there for retail purposes at the moment now, or decreasingly so. they'll find other reasons to go there, and they could be really positive and make a difference to places. And I think as well there's that power that the mayor and the authority have to engage some people that the culture sector struggle to. So I think developers are really important in this space. And those developers often sponsor some of the big organisations in London, but maybe the mayor and the authority can play a role there in terms of helping them engage with some of the issues around grassroots culture. And then I think there's something about, when we talked about the challenges of diversity, and the sector isn't how we want it to look and be at the moment in terms of both the people that work in it, but also audiences. If you think around things like interventions in the economy and around skills policy, there's a, in that broadest sense, it's not going to be cultural interventions that will make a difference there. It will be some of those things that the mayor has responsibility for in terms of setting priorities and strategies and how they impact on culture and the creative industries. So I think that needs consideration. And then I think there's something about kind of some of the policy sort of challenges that are on the doorstep at the moment. So, we talked about some of the lack of capacity that cultural organisations have, the smaller ones. If their workforce is freelance, or if they don't can call on some of those specific skills that some of the larger organisations can do, it's a capacity challenge. So, if you think about UK Share Prosperity Fund coming on stream soon, how can that support to build some of the capacity that could really, support the cultural sector moving forward? And I think the final thing we'll reference is just a very little line in the white paper that wasn't the Levelling Up white paper, which wasn't about culture, but was about saying to the Greater London Authority, inviting to come forward for requests. I think the phrase is sweeping new powers. Well, what would the sweeping new powers be around culture? And actually, they're probably quite likely to be beyond culture. It's in that planning, that regulation. We've heard about regulation and licensing space today. It might be about access to particular sorts of finance that, like that got help to get the Creative Land Trust off the ground. It's these things which aren't immediately cultural, but could come through, further devolution, which might make a big difference to culture in the city, and think about that from the grassroots perspective.
That's useful. I think the mayor's convening power is an important one you mentioned. It's interesting to hear you echo things that have come up in our previous investigations about the mayor's adult education budget, which obviously has a role to play in terms of, we looked at apprenticeships and, obviously there are lots of those potentially in this field. And licensing, our previous investigation was into street markets, and licensing is a big factor there as well. So it's interesting to hear that echoed again. Lorna, so again about what the mayor or the GLA could do.
So I think it is that connectivity, both connecting and so I think it's that we've heard some good case studies today. And sometimes it's about the case studies of how they've navigated the non-traditional routes or the existing routes, how have they solved the problems? Because it's quite likely that those similar problems are right across London. So it's supporting people who haven't probably got the time to go to conferences and seminars. How do you have a really quick how-to guide for some of these things? So there have been initiatives like the nighttime economy. London Borough of Culture obviously put culture on they use the GLA platform to really talk about outer London culture, which I think is important, and also the work on the Jobs Academy. So I really do think it's as well as funding, which I shall almost say is going without saying, it's promoting best practice, but promoting best practice to people who aren't necessarily in that cultural sphere, so that they really understand how their area might wish to engage with culture, because it can actually achieve their goals too.
Great, thanks. Clara.
Sure, so I have a few thoughts on it. I think one of the things that could be like a very practical thing that the GLA could do is some form of maybe registry of empty spaces that might then be able to be used for either grassroots music venues or theatres. I think at the moment what we're seeing is a lot of venue operators are having to leave their premises, whether it's because of their lease or rent reviews or things like that. And actually at the moment they're sort of struggling to find, well, where do we move to? And so I think actually some kind of collaboration or networking or mapping exercise where we could sort of start reviewing where is the spaces that people could move into. Traditionally, that's not been on the high street for grassroots music venues. It's been, things like industrial estates and things like that. But maybe now, because of, things are moving more locally, maybe it is the high street. And so, where can we find these spaces and kind of create friendly and sort of benevolent conditions where actually we're saying, no, we want you to be there on a long-term basis. You're kind of contributing, 20, 30 years. And I think, so finding those spaces could be a practical thing. Again, from a music venue trust perspective, we've been working with the GLA for years, and particularly the culture team there. Our next kind of big project is called Own Our Venues. It's about trying to secure the freehold of grassroots music venues to kind of create that long-term resilience. I think that's quite difficult in London. Again, property prices are so expensive, but I think it's an ambition to work towards, and I think it actually could be really exciting in London. So getting kind of understanding of that and what that could mean in London, potentially some sort of cultural match funding, best practice learning from other kind of organisations as well, the Creative Land Trust, things like that. I think there's loads of really good opportunities, and I think it could be both bigger sky, kind of structural, kind of blue sky thinking, as well as just very practical spaces of, I want to open a grassroots music venue, where should I do it,
That's very useful. Thank you very much, Clara, and I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you so much. Very quickly to Assembly Member Plansky.
Thank you. Clara, my colleague Sian Berry has just done a big piece of work on this called Dead Spaces, which is looking at the empty buildings that are council or publicly owned. And I'd love to kind of hook you up with that. So
absolutely,
there could be some ideas. There isn't really a question there, actually. I just wanted to make sure
I didn't know about that, so I'd absolutely love to read about that.
Yeah, I was trying to find a question, but there's no point.
I'll let you off there, just this once. Thank you so much. I'd like to actually thank the Assembly members. You've managed to pull out some really interesting points, and one that I didn't expect, which was about mental health. And I was really pleased that we've managed to pull that out with the guests here. Thank you so much for enlightening us and bringing forward so many ideas that we need to put within our report to the Mayor, but also specifically the Deputy Mayor and the Assembly members here will be working together to make sure that we pull out a lot of the questions that you've brought to us, but particularly on the GLA's culture team and on the London Borough of Culture's programme. So thank you very much, guests, for attending this meeting and for all the answers to our questions. We're just going to wrap up quite quickly now. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for 2022-2023 Assembly year? Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the wonderful site visit to Brixton Market, which I thoroughly enjoyed, on the 18th of May 2022?
Noted, and thank you to the Eggman.
We do love some coconuts, don't we, as well? That was quite fun. The next meeting of the Economy Committee is scheduled for the 7th of September 2022 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. Thank you so much, everyone. And I think we have no urgent business, which concludes our wonderful meeting for today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.